Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to see so many people at 9 o'clock in the morning in this theatre. An extraordinary experience for us as this whole exhibition, Secrets of the Silk Road, has proved to be. You might like to know that we've so far had 35,000 people visit the exhibit that's upstairs, which is virtually what we would get in a year in 1 month. For us, it's been an enormous transformation that we hope will lead to the remaking of our galleries and better stewarding of our own collections. But most of all, too, we hope that it will lead to more research of the kind that I think is going to be on show today. This conference, Reconfiguring the Silk Road, really is a reprise of a major conference that Victor Mayer, the curator of Secrets of the Silk Road, 15 years ago held to great acclaim here in this museum and subsequently published about the Tarim Basin, its mummies, and most of all the archaeological issues arising from those wonderful discoveries by our Chinese colleagues. So 15 years on, we're very grateful to be able to have this reprise, a reprise that will take us from prehistory well into the Middle Ages in the course of the next 8 hours. Our thanks in particular to the Henry Luce Foundation for making it possible to hold today's conference, symposium, in particular their program officer, Helena Kolenda, who is here today and has been a great friend to this museum as it's worked on Asian archaeology. Our thanks too to the University of Pennsylvania Center for Ancient Studies and its director, Professor Bob Osterhout, who's also here today, who's also funded this symposium. This symposium will be videotaped and you will be able to see it on the website, so if you miss some of the provocation during the course of the day, you will be able to catch up with it subsequently. Its organization is due in a large merit to Victor Mayer himself, who will speak this morning, and to Jane Hickman, the editor of Expedition and our special programs manager. She is the maestro of all the proceedings, the various elements that go on today, and if you have any difficulties whatsoever, address yourself to her vis-a-vis coffee, lunch, or the subsequent reception. We have a fairly tight schedule, but we hope to have a major discussion at the end. Sadly, Philip Cole, Professor of Anthropology at Wellesley, can't be here because of ill health, though he's prepared some remarks, and Dr. Chris Thornton, one of our own, so to speak, will be giving those remarks. And knowing Chris, he will also add his own views on these things, since he's well-versed in that part of Eurasia. With that, I'd like to hand the podium over to my colleague Brian Rose, the Deputy Director, who will now chair the morning session. Brian.
Thank you, Richard, and welcome everyone. There will be 4 papers in the morning session with a break after the first 2 papers, and there will be time at the end of each of the papers for some questions. We have microphones set up on either side of the auditorium, and there'll be students who will take the microphone to you in the audience if you have questions. We begin with Colin Renfrew, who is Disney Professor Emeritus of Archaeology and former director of the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at the University of Cambridge. He is now Senior Fellow of the MacDonald Institute. His first book, The Emergence of Civilization, The Cyclades and the Aegean in the Third Millennium BC, published in 1972, established Professor Renfrew as a leading scholar of Aegean prehistory. In addition to his continuing work in the Aegean, Professor Renfrew's research interests include archaeological theory and science, especially DNA and molecular genetics, and the origins of linguistic diversity. Among his many publications is Archaeology and Language, The Puzzle of the Indo-European Origins. His talk for us today is entitled Before Silk, Unsolved Mysteries of the Silk Road. Colin.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Brian, and thank you, Richard. It's a great pleasure to be here again at one of these controversial symposia. I very much enjoyed the first one which Victor organized, and I hope we're going to have some very lively and interesting discussions today. Really, for me, I'm talking about the period before silk, or at any rate before the Silk Road really opened up. As I understand it, and we'll hear more about this later, the earliest finds of silk in the Western world are more or less Hellenistic date. So the things I'm talking about are before the Silk Road opened up for silk. And so one is talking about the even vaster issue of the early connections between East and West, between Asia, between East and Asia, between China on the one hand and the West, that is to say the Near East as we call it, Western Asia, and Europe on the other hand. And it turns out to be one of the liveliest themes in world archaeology today, because it's only in the past 2 decades that it's been easy for researchers from one part of the world to work in another part of the world. So it's only recently that the steppe lands of Russia and beyond to the east and the paths of the Silk Road have become open to investigation, and that Eastern scholars, Chinese and Uyghur and other scholars, have been able to visit the Western world and study in the Western world and vice versa. So we're talking about the vast terrain which is indicated in that slide. Now, there are many Silk Roads, it's fair to say, but we are focusing on the Tarim Basin, on Xinjiang, the Xinjiang Autonomous Uyghur Republic, or province of the People's Republic of China. So we're dealing, I think, primarily with this part of the Silk Road, but it's worth remembering that there are many Silk Roads, really, and we have to bear in mind the maritime route, although that no doubt opened up rather late in the day, and the whole range of routes which there are between East and West. But I want to make one of the keynotes of my talk today, even if it means being a little provocative, that I think the main Silk Road is as indicated on that map, and it runs south there of the Caspian Sea. And it runs down along the route to places like Antioch on the Orontes, places on the Mediterranean coast. So I shall be making the point that it is important to distinguish between the steppe lands and the Silk Road. And I think a lot of confusion has arisen in recent years by eliding the two. Both are important. Now, of course, the great romance of the Silk Road was revealed to us in the late 19th and the early 20th century when the Taklamakan Desert was first explored and then for some decades rather neglected. And so this was the stamping ground of Sir Aurel Stein and other intrepid explorers in the early decades of the 20th century, both before and after the First World War. And it was there in these lost cities of the desert that Aurel Stein and his contemporaries made astonishing discoveries. And of course, one of the most interesting was the documents, mainly Buddhist documents, of about the 8th century AD, which Aurel Stein and his contemporaries found, and he was able to get access to the great cache of documents at Dunhuang, and indeed bring many of them to the Western world, a controversial issue which I'm not proposing to go into this evening, except to remind you that among these documents were documents of what we now call the Tocharian language. And when this was deciphered fairly rapidly, the script is not a problem, it's an alphabetic script. But when the language was deciphered and translated, it turned out to be an Indo-European language. And this was a very surprising discovery, to find an Indo-European language placed so far to the east in the Tarim Depression in the Taklamakan Desert. And it remains documented there and essentially nowhere else. But its relationship to the Indo-European language family is well attested, and Dr. Mallory will no doubt be talking more about that this morning. Now, the preservation is extraordinary in this desert climate. And this is one of the cities there. This is Gaochang, and there are well-preserved buildings in these totally abandoned cities. When I say well-preserved, they're ruined, but there's lots of them. But it is in recent years that the human remains, so well-preserved in the burials, they're sometimes called mummies, but they're naturally desiccated remains, have been discovered or rediscovered, because some were in fact found by Orlstein and his contemporaries, by our Chinese and Uyghur colleagues. And so I had the privilege of visiting this site, Subeishi, with its excavator, Liu Engguo, some years ago, and it's outside of Tuifan at the foot of the Flaming Mountains, and here are the Flaming Mountains. It must have been an extraordinary experience to go from Xi'an, the great capital of China at the period, and go west and pursue along the Silk Road down as far as the Mediterranean world. And of course, it's hugely dry, it's loess soil, so when there is rainfall, when there is water, there isn't really rainfall, but when there's a water course, then you see how the loess soil is cut through by the river. And here is the cemetery itself at the time of its excavation. And here is this extraordinary figure, this female burial, of which a part is in the exhibition here. This woman with her winter clothing and her extraordinary hat, which looks like a magician's or a witch's hat, this very interesting form of hat. And there is this extraordinary garment again. Now, this really is why the Silk Road is so important to us, and I think it sometimes gives rise to misunderstandings, because we find wonderfully preserved things in these sites, and sometimes the nearest comparanda are far away to the west, and that suggests links, but I think part of the reason for that is that the intermediate evidence has often been completely lost. And there is the excavator, Liu Engguo, on the left of this slide. Now, I think it's helpful to remind ourselves of the steplands, and we'll see, no doubt, in the course of this conference, many diagrams of the steplands. And the steplands, as sketched there, are the yellow area on the map. But we see Xinjiang province with Urumqi and so on in the area there to the south. And most of Xinjiang province lies well to the south of the steplands. And this is a point I want to emphasize today, because I think there have been confusions. And I almost gave the subtitle of my lecture, One Wheel, Few Horses, but I thought that might be too provocative, so I thought I would introduce that only later. But here is indeed the saddle found in the burials at Subeishi, which is indeed a horse's saddle, and as the excavators indicated, this is what it would have looked like when in use. But it is not the case that horses are particularly well documented in this area, and they're certainly not documented significantly in the burials before the first millennium BC, and of course we have no finds to speak of yet prior to the second millennium BC. The glory, or the glory of the finds from Xinjiang are the wonderful textiles, mainly woolen textiles, and Elizabeth Barber, who is the greatest expert, will be talking about them later on today. So I'm not going to try and say very much about them. This example is from about 1300 before the Common Era, from the site of Hamiwupu, and I bring it on because this wheel, there may be other discoveries of wheels, but this is the only one with which I'm familiar, and I hope to be corrected and told of others if they do exist. And this, of course, is a wooden wheel of the same date. And I think it's worth saying that wheels were not very important in the Silk Road, and you wouldn't expect them to be. Because if you were traveling from Xi'an westwards through the Taklamakan Desert, a horse and cart, or even a bullock and cart, or even a camel and cart would not be your first requisite. Because traveling on the Silk Road before tarmac was not an easy task for wheels. And so I want to make that point because it may be that I will fall into disagreement with some of my colleagues who will be speaking later on this theme. And I want to make the point that whereas I deeply respect the work that has been done to show the early use of the wheel on the steppelands, I don't think it's a very important part of the Silk Road story. And then we go on to this wonderful find from Yingpan, which is in the exhibition, and this emphasizes the richness of the textiles of the Silk Road in the early Han period. More or less, we're talking now about Hellenistic Roman times. And the finds, as you will have seen, are exquisite and breathtaking, and there's nothing like this anywhere else in the world of this kind of preservation. When you're lucky, you find textiles and silks in very early Christian contexts, which I hope we'll be hearing about later today, but this kind of preservation is totally exceptional. And so here are some of these textiles with these nice putti, clearly some inspiration from the Western world by now, but as I say, we're talking about the period of the Han dynasty. So I want to make this point again, that I think the elision between the steppelands and the Silk Road, which enters some discussions, is insufficiently discriminating. And I think it's very useful to try and make the distinction. And the exceptional preservation in the Taklamakan Desert and related areas is because of the aridity of the Silk Road, which made the Silk Road inappropriate for wheel transport and less than ideal for pack horses either. So I want to give my thanks to the colleagues who've helped me on my visit and who've indeed helped me subsequently. I had the pleasure of going to Xinjiang with Professor Mei Jianjun of the University of Science and Technology and was much assisted by the excavators of some of the things that we're going to see. So there is my subtitle. I've allowed it to creep in now, one wheel, few horses. And so I want to deal with these topics, the earliest contacts and the millet question, then the first settlers in Xinjiang, very well documented, the first known settlers at present, very well documented by the wonderful exhibits from Shaohe in the exhibition, and then the question of the first copper metallurgy, the question of the first chariots in China, and then the first mounted warriors. And really, this is an important point which I think has been overlooked in many discussions. It really does seem to be possibly the case I'm rather persuaded, or I say possibly so as not to appear overly contentious, that the first mounted warriors on any degree made their appearance in the steppes around about 1000 before the Common Era, or perhaps a little earlier in the heartlands of the steppes, 1200 before the Common Era, in the Andronovo culture of the Eurasian steppes. And so all the talk about mounted warrior nomads spreading Indo-European languages hither and thither, I think is profoundly misguided. This is a matter of controversy, and you may hear alternative views expressed in the course of the morning, which I shall suffer with the greatest good humor and patience, but as I'll say later in my talk, I think there are matters which are suitable grounds for controversy, and then I'll say a little about the Indo-European question. Now, this slide I owe to Dr. Xinyi Liu, and it highlights the two interesting and most striking events in East-West contacts, which we don't understand very well: the finding of broomcorn millet, Panicum miliaceum, in contacts before 5000 BC, on the one hand in China, and on the other hand in Western Asia and in Europe. How can that be? Well, it is the case. And secondly, the finding of wheat, hexaploid wheat, bread wheat, in Shaohe and other settlements, but Shaohe is the one where it's been most effectively identified, and I think identified beyond doubt. And it's generally understood, and I think it must be right, that this wheat originates in the West. Now, if we're going to talk first of all about the millet question, there is the map from Harriet Hunt as modified by Xinyi Liu, and this shows us the finds of millet before that can be fairly confidently assigned before 5000 before Common Era. Now, there is the possibility that millet was independently domesticated more than once. And though that may seem improbable, it seems to me more likely than to have quite profuse contacts between East and West along what we're calling the Silk Road before 5000 before the Common Era. I don't have time to go through the work that's been done on the millet, but DNA analyses on recent millets does seem to show two main gene pools, if you look at the primary split, which perhaps encourages the notion of independent domestication, but a more detailed analysis, this is from the work of Harriet Hunt, shows a number of gene pools, and the matter is still unclear. So I just raise that as one of the first unresolved mysteries of the Silk Road. The next issue is the first settlers in Xinjiang province, and the site here that we see on the right with the red dot is this wonderful site of Shaohe, which is so richly documented in the exhibition. The original excavator is with us today, the person who first relocated the site. It was, of course, investigated and published as Urdex necropolis in the early 20th century, and Victor Mayer has written a very good paper about that. But Dr. Wang Binghua is the person who relocated it, and then Dr. Idris Abdurasul is the person who has re-excavated it in recent years, and that is him at the left of that photograph. And so what we see in the exhibition is largely the work of his excavation and his team at Urumqi in the Institute of Archaeology of the Uyghur Autonomous Republic. So here are, as you've seen also from the exhibition, the remarkable indications, the astonishing preservation. These posts still stand when excavated, still standing for all those years. I mean, it's extraordinary. For 4,000 years, these timbers have stood in the desert. And there's very good evidence of the artifacts. The pottery is not discovered at the site, although it must have been known earlier, but perhaps clays were not available. But the preservation is extraordinary. Here is my snapshot photo of the coffins just for storage, piled one on top of each other in the Urumqi Institute. And here is one of the beauties. There are several beauties from the area, but this is the beauty of Shaohe. And a great deal has been made of the seemingly Eurasian look. But I was very impressed by some of the beauties whom I met and saw in Xinjiang. These are Uyghur speaking ladies, and I'm not altogether persuaded that there is any huge difference, and I'll say a word about the molecular genetic evidence in a moment, to make so categorical a distinction. And there is my wife enjoying the company of these very charming young ladies. And in the burials at Shaohe are found these wonderfully preserved baskets containing cereal grain and this wheat mainly, and millet, broomcorn millet, and ephedra. So it's a remarkable excavation and gives a great deal of new information. But I should mention the molecular genetic results on ancient DNA, which have been interpreted sometimes as giving clear indication of influence of population from the West. And I'm sure in a general sense that's true, but it really is not clear when that took place. It might have taken place thousands of years earlier. So I think a simplistic notion of equating language with culture, with genetics, can be an oversimplification. And so though I agree with scholars who suggest that the Tocharian language, which is not attested till about the 8th century AD, the Tocharian language, this Indo-European language, may well have come, must really have come from the West, and may well have come in Proto-Tocharian form with the first population or an early population of Xinjiang. That early population may have been very much earlier. And also, I'd like to make the point, which hasn't been emphasized sufficiently, that I think it's possible that the approach to the arrival of Proto-Tocharian may have been along the Silk Road. And I've been at pains to distinguish between the Silk Road and the steppe region, and Tocharian may well have come along through these passes of the Silk Road, as indeed the first wheat we've been speaking of, and maybe even the first millet, if that really was a single domestication process, although if it was a single domestication process, perhaps the flow was the other way from China to the West. But I think we should be thinking about the possibility that relative languages to early Tocharian may have existed further west along the Silk Road, although without any direct evidence, that's very difficult to discuss. Wonderful preservation at Shaohe. This is a felt hat. It's just absolutely extraordinary. Anyway, I must move on and say a word about the earliest metallurgy in Xinjiang, This is a subject that's been very well treated by Mei Jianjun, and so I don't have very much to add to it. And these slides are ones which he kindly lent to me for this talk. And there you have on the right, you have the early metallurgy of the Shang dynasty of China from sites like Erlitou. And then on the left you have the finds which are just as early or maybe earlier in Xinjiang province, which has some of the earliest copper finds of China. And so it seems very possible, indeed probable, that the technology, copper working technology, did indeed come to China either along the Silk Road or more likely along the steppe route, and that these finds which Mei Jianjun has documented, these finds from around 1500 BC or a little earlier, this may be the, still to me, very surprisingly late origin of copper metallurgy in China, which so rapidly became so influential with the development of the wonderful Shang bronzes and Zhou bronzes and so on. However, this is a story that's been well discussed by Mei Jianjun and his colleagues, so I don't have anything to add to that, except to say that I think there's still a great deal to learn about that process, and certainly these intermediate areas, including Xinjiang, are an important part of the story. The same is true of the first chariots. David Anthony will be talking to us, I hope, about those today, and I think the work of himself and his Russian colleagues has really clarified the origins of the chariot, which is first documented at Sintashta around 2000 BC, as he indicated in his article in Antiquity many years ago. Again, I want to emphasize that the chariot is associated with the steppe lands, as indeed is the horse, and indeed, as we'll see in a moment, are the mounted warrior horsemen. But it is impressive that the chariot became so important in Mesopotamia and indeed ultimately in Egypt, and was a chosen vehicle for transport in warfare, just as it became in Zhou times in China. And it's still unclear to me how the chariot reached China at a detailed level. I think we don't doubt that these finds from Sintashta are just about the earliest chariot finds that there are, and presumably the chariot reached China along the steppe lands, but the chariot is not found significantly, or indeed I think at all, in Xinjiang, nor would you expect to be in that terrain, which would not be suitable for chariots, so it must have been a more northern route. And though there's great scholarship on the chariots of the Zhou period in China, the distinguished article by Shaughnessy and so on, the question of the actual mechanism of the transmission of the chariot has, I think, not been well addressed yet, or not that I'm aware of. And here again, there's the Sintashta finds, which are very clear. It's further east that the picture becomes less clear, until you find them, of course, at Anyang and so on, in the burials of the Shang and Zhou periods. But I say the mechanism of transmission is not very clear. Now to my penultimate point, the first mounted warriors in China. And I think it's clear that the first mounted warriors in China were around 1000 BC. There is, very interestingly, new radiocarbon evidence from the site of Liu Shui in the Kunlun Mountains at the south side of the Taklamakan Desert in Xinjiang province. And these dates seem to be earlier than the dates from the so-called Scythian tombs at Arjan, which are around 800 BC further to the north. And these are the first documented mounted nomad warriors. That is when, as I understand it, the economy of the steppes changed very significantly, no doubt with antecedents in the Andronovo culture, as Russian scholars have argued, but this is approximately 1000 BC. The evidence is becoming clearer and better documented, and indeed better and better understood. And I know Michael Fracchetti, who's going to be talking to us this morning, has views about the development of local economies and the way, if you rightly study individual areas, you begin to understand the processes of transformation which led to these fundamental changes in the economy of the steppe lands, which had their impact also on the Silk Road. So there is Herman Partsinger's map of the Andronovo culture, and there at the right is the site of Sazi in Xinjiang province, and there is Meijanjun's sketches of pottery of the Andronovo culture at that locality, and his drawing of pieces of broadly Scythian character. I dislike using the word Scythian far to the east, because we know something about the Scythians in the Ukraine and about the language of the Scythians, and I'm not sure that it's appropriate to use the term Scythian so far east as this, but it's similar mounted warrior nomads anyway. And there is one of those wonderful gold neck rings from Arjan, from the very rich burials at Arjan, which I was just mentioning, and some of the horse accoutrements there. And then here's this wonderful piece of preserved textile from Pazyryk, from the burials at Pazyryk. Well, that leads me very rapidly to my final point, and that is Indo-European origins. And now this may not be the occasion for a complete rehearsal of the Indo-European problem, though it would be a pleasure, but maybe for later on in the day. But there are, at the moment, I think, two preferred models. One is for an early origin in Anatolia, in Turkey, around 6,000–7,000 before the Common Era, and that is the farming language dispersal model. And the other is for the Kurgan mounted nomad warriors, Maria Gimbutas's theory, following that of Gordon Childe and predecessors, centered in the Ukraine. As I've already indicated, I think this is based on a misconception. I do understand that the horse was domesticated for feeding purposes much earlier, and then you see it first used in warfare with these chariots around 2000 BC, and then the mounted nomad warriors really spring onto their horses and gallop off, making warfare around 1000 BC, and not much earlier in my view. So that just summarizes. There's not much more to say about that. For the steppe lands, I think the work of David Anthony and colleagues has indicated sites like Derevka and others in Kazakhstan, site of Botai. You have horses being extensively used for food from 3,500, and very possibly being ridden for horse management purposes, and then I've already mentioned those other points. Now, to turn to the Indo-European family, this is a tree from Don Ringe and his colleagues, and the beginning above Hittite is Proto-Indo-European, and then Hittite, which of course is one of the Indo-European languages of what is now Turkey, of Anatolia, is the earliest, and then Tocharian is the next branch. And you have to come right down to the bottom of the tree to get to Vedic and Avestan when you come to the Indo-Iranian languages, of which Sogdian and probably Scythian are examples around the first millennium BC, reaching as far as this area. Sogdian, as we've seen in the exhibition, was spoken in the first millennium AD in this area. And so I would now keep on changing my mind on this. I said something slightly different at the symposium here a decade ago. I rather wonder if Tocharian did indeed reach Xinjiang along the Silk Road, maybe from, I'm not saying it was the language of the Bactrian Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, so-called BMAC, but it may have been spoken in that area, and it may well have been learnt there directly from Turkey, which lies to the west, a point that Victor Saryanidi himself has made in the past. Well, this is the rather complicated diagram from Gray and Atkinson, but I want to indicate to you the dates. If I press the right button here, I may... No, I was going to show you... there we are. These dates here are years BP before the present, and the earliest division between Hittite and the rest on their system is 6,700 before the Common Era. And then you get Tocharian very soon afterwards, and then it's rather later that you get the relevant dates for the Indo-Iranian family. Well, I can't go into that in detail now, and dates are always controversial matters among linguists, so it would be completely wrong to put the same weight on calculated dates calculated by skilled linguists, whereas radiocarbon dates are not precise always, but I think in a general sense they're fairly reliable. But on that system, you will see that the dates for the original Indo-European dispersal there is the age in millennia before the present, and the pale green shading, where they happen to lie, is what would be predicted on the farming language dispersal hypothesis, and the pale blue shading is what would be predicted on the Kurgan hypothesis. And without being unduly contentious, I would point out that they do not lie in the pale blue area. So that's more detail of the same, really. So I think this is a possible scenario for the early occupation of the Silk Road, sparse hunter-gatherer population in the 5th millennium BC. And that's what we don't really know very much about yet. And this is what we must expect our Chinese and Uyghur colleagues to work on. That's what we want to know about, and the evidence must be there. Then the acquisition of millet cultivation from Gansu in the 4th millennium, I imagine, and I've left open the question of whether there was really contacts with the West, that whole millet question that I've discussed. And then around 3000 BC, I imagine we have a farming language dispersal from the West, certainly documented at Shaohe by 2000 BC, with that hexaploid wheat, that red wheat. And as I've indicated, though it's very hypothetical, I imagine that there may be an association with Proto-Tocharian coming in maybe from somewhere like Turkmenia around that time. And then we have the chariots getting going at 1500 BC, but not making any great impact on the Silk Road itself. And then the mounted nomad warriors around 1000 BC do change the world. That was a massive change of the world. And then we have later on Tocharian and Sogdian and so on. And then, of course, it's after that that the Silk Road really opens up as a Silk Road, which we're looking forward to hearing about from Peter Brown Joseph Manning this afternoon. And here is this famous image allegedly representing Tocharian warriors of the around the 8th century BC. And there is, here I take my bow and thank you very much.
Thank you for that masterful overview of the Silk Road. Could we have the microphones up, please, and the lights on? We have time for several questions. So with that, I would like to throw the floor open to the audience.
I've tried to be provocative, so I hope somebody is provoked. I'll do it.
Would you be willing to consider a seed dispersal for early millet, for example, or metal, or anything else?
I'd certainly be willing to consider such a thing, but it's difficult if we're talking about millet, and we're talking about before 5,000, before the Common Era, 5,000 BC. I think it's quite difficult to imagine communication between the Mediterranean world and the Far East by that date by sea. If we're talking about copper, when we're talking copper metallurgy around 1500 BC, I think it's still quite difficult. I'm not sure that the distribution of early copper working in China is particularly focused on the coast, not that it would have to be if it was a maritime distribution. So I would think that really prolonged contact by sea between the West and China didn't really develop until after the Silk Road had got underway. It's another question if we're talking about a southern Silk Road, a land Silk Road, but going down into South China and then through Southeast Asia. But there isn't very much evidence for that yet. So I'm sorry to have been rather lengthy. I think the answer to your question is no.
If you were a stock raiser and you were living in the Tarim Basin and possibly going north to graze your livestock in the winter, then the remains in the Tarim Basin would be only half of the evidence of those people.
That's very right. And one thing that supports that point of view is the wonderful variation in the clothing that you find in the burials. Elizabeth Barber could speak to this much better than I, but you see clothing that's suited for winter, and in some burials you see clothing that is suited for summer. And you're quite right, they must have been on the move. I haven't really seen any very careful discussions of what the pattern of movement of one community would have been at any particular time. The sort of work that Michael Fracchetti has been doing in Kazakhstan, and he may have some ideas on that. I think there is the real problem, as Victor Mayer has emphasized, that the burials at Shaohe are burials, it's a cemetery, it's a concentration, and their dwelling places have not been located. This is not too surprising with what may have been a mobile community, but it is not clear that these were nomads in the sense of having significant transhumance, which I think you were perhaps referring to, which may have developed later. They were mobile people, but they may have been partly mobile in the way that hunter-gatherers tended to be. Of course, they had their livestock, including some cattle, but I don't think in the absence of their settlement evidence, it's been possible to give any very deep thought as to the extent of the mobility of that community on an annual basis. And that would be something would be very interesting to take further. So I think your point is right, but it's not really been very much addressed so far.
One tiny little addition to your point about the broomcorn millet suddenly turning up at two ends of Eurasia. there are some interesting things to do with weaving that suddenly turn up at both ends of Eurasia at about that same time. So there's more out there to answer for that we haven't found. There are fairly clear connections between what's happening in terms of textiles in East Asia and what's happening in terms of textiles in Western Eurasia at about 5000 BC. I too don't know how these were getting through, but what it means is we need to keep looking in the middle.
What textiles do we have at 5000 BC? I could understand what you were saying if you were speaking around 2000 BC, but where have we got the textiles to make the comparisons at 5000?
Well, we have the impressions on pottery that show that they were making, and we also have evidence apparently that they were using hemp in East Asia before they started using things like silk. That's much later. They were already making textiles. They were apparently making them out of hemp. And the impressions on the pottery suggest that they already knew the heddle. And the heddle is such a strange, conceptually difficult device that it is probable that it was only thought up once in the late Paleolithic. And about 5000 BC, you start getting this evidence welling up in East Asia, and you're getting much, much more of it in Western Eurasia. We have a lot more data in Western Eurasia, but it's very peculiar that it suddenly turns up in East Asia about 5000 BC.
I think we've got to be very cautious about what we can propose, but be very cautious about accepting long-distance connections at a particular time period. As you said, and as you know much more about it than I do, the evidence for textile production or weaving or sort of simple techniques of that kind is increasingly emerging in the Upper Paleolithic period. And so if we see something occurring at times where the preservation is not good, we don't actually have textiles to speak of in the sense of we can actually feel the textiles in very many cases at so early a date. So it's perfectly possible that some of the things we may notice here at one time and there at another time do go back to the Upper Paleolithic period. I'm not suggesting that about the millet, although maybe not excluded, but I think we have to be cautious about suggesting very long-distance connections at any individual period, particularly if it's possible they may both be the product of a descent, as it were, cultural descent from a much earlier time period. So I think it's a very interesting area, but I think we shouldn't reach a conclusion too readily on those problems.
Thank you again, Colin, for that lecture. First, I want to make a quick response in terms of the migratory patterns, just because it was brought up, and I do have a question. My best understanding, as someone who's worked in that region with... Sure, is that better? My best understanding of the migratory patterns of pastoralists who live sort of around the Tarim Basin is, as Colin mentioned, the use of mountains rather than sort of grasslands. And so if you imagine the basin literally as a depression of pretty poor pasture land, the only territories where you're going to get any kind of pasture is actually up, not necessarily north. So you can imagine the Tarim Basin effectively ringed by mountains, and I'll say more about that later. But I think that that's an important distinction when considering that this is a region that's very different from the open steppes of Eurasia. So that's just that point. My question, in fact, comes back to what you mentioned about genetics, and I was hoping that you would say a bit more about some of the detailed evidence, just a few more words about what the various lines of evidence are, and what your best understanding, I suppose, of how to package them in terms of some of these broader questions of East and West. I think that, as you rightly pointed out, from my perspective, genetics can be a very dangerous and exciting scientific tool. and one that oftentimes leads to fantastic conclusions, but ones that have to, of course, be tested. So I'm wondering if you could say a few more words about that.
Thank you. First of all, your first point, I think, is very well taken, and it perhaps gives a hint at the way archaeology should, or archaeological research should be developing in Xinjiang. There really ought to be cave sites and shelter sites to slightly higher altitude where one can find Upper Paleolithic or maybe very early Neolithic traces. And it doesn't all have to be in the desert sands of the basin itself. And I'm not sure that very much surface survey, much site survey of an intensive nature has been carried out at those slightly higher altitudes. And I'm sure what you say is right, that there really ought to be summer sites on the uplands, which it would be very profitable to discover, and that is maybe where to look for more traces of the Shaohe community. So I agree with that very much. On the molecular genetic front, it was our closing speaker today, Chris Thornton, who wrote an interesting article with Tad Shore some years ago in the Oxford Journal of Archaeology, taking, I think it's fair to say, a rather cautious view. I think, first of all, the molecular genetics of the contemporary populations have not yet been very fully explored. And I think it always makes sense to imagine how much of what one sees may be a product of local continuities rather than all kinds of comings and goings. And as I understand it, the mitochondrial DNA data, that's the data in the female line, it shows very strong local continuities. If we're talking about the relatively few samples that have been analyzed, although it's great that they have been by Chinese colleagues from the site of Shaohe and other nearby sites, and the female lineages do seem to be local of East Asian types, whereas it's certainly the case that the Y chromosome evidence, which indicates the male line, does suggest some strong influences from the West. But there the problem is that our knowledge about the Y chromosome data in the West is built mainly on the understanding of recent populations, of living populations. There are rather few ancient DNA analyses that have been conducted in the West up to now. They've been happening in the past 2 or 3 years, and the inferences that one is beginning to draw from those Western analyses, if we're talking about the spread of agriculture and so on in Western Europe, do suggest a lot of surprises. When you actually compare ancient DNA with ancient DNA, it doesn't suggest that the ancient DNA are just automatically the parents of the living population of today. So I think it's a field of some complexity that is of great promise, but it may be, as I already hinted, that the Y chromosome features that seem to be Western features could be thousands of years earlier in Xinjiang province, and we shouldn't imagine people, just a complete new population sweeping in around 2000 BC from the West. That is an implication that has been suggested, but the strong mitochondrial DNA lineages, some of them that have taken some time to for the admixture of genes to work out, I think suggests caution. And I believe that the next 10 or 20 years are going to be very rewarding as we have more and more ancient DNA dates. We should remember that most of what we know about molecular genetics at present comes from the molecular genetics of living populations, which are much easier to work with. But I hope Chris himself will say something about that in his concluding remarks.